Hello, everybody. Welcome to About Jesus podcast. I'm Steve Sweetman, and I'm with my good friend Robert Bailey. And today we're going to talk about the King James Bible. And Robert, back in 1970, when I first became a real Christian, I went to a local Christian bookstore and bought a large print Bible, large print New Testament actually, and it was King James. And from that King
Hmm.
James, I memorized more than 1,800 verses. And I know you did a lot of memorizing back in those days too. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And I memorized from the King James Version too. That was
Yeah.
in the early 70s.
Well, a couple years later, I went back to the Christian bookstore and bought a large print NIV Bible when it first came out. But you mentioned to me earlier that there are some people that won't even enter the door of a Christian bookstore these days because they sell Bibles that are not King James Version.
That's
Why
right.
would that be the case?
Well, I think it's a sad testimony on Christianity, but it literally is true. I'm friends with some people that run a local Christian bookstore, and they have told me that because they carry versions of the Bible other than the King James, there are Christians who will not enter their store. And I've taught a series on called How We Got the Bible. I've done it several times, and I have been studying this issue for more than 30 years. It's one of my favorite topics, and I actually have a whole bookshelf of dozens of books that relate to this topic. And I still read books on this topic, and as new books come out, I always find a little more information. So I find it a fascinating topic, and this question is something that has come up. As a student in one of my classes mentioned to me, her mother said when she found out she was taking a class from me on this topic, her mother said, if the King James was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me,
Hmm.
which I thought was pretty funny. So it goes back uh, prior to the 1600s, apparently, Steve, because Jesus himself apparently used the King James
Oh, that's
Version.
quite interesting. So I bet you Paul must have used it too.
I guess so. Now, the facts on the case are that the King James came out in 1611, and the reason that it's called the Authorized Version is because it was authorized or initialized by King James
So it
at
wasn't
that time.
authorized by God, you're saying?
Well, it was authorized by King James, and that's
Okay.
how it got its name.
Hmm.
Um, and the emphasis there being that many versions of the Bible came out prior to that in English were certainly not authorized. In fact, the translators were put to death because of the audacity of translating the Bible from Latin into English. That was considered heretical, and many people were put to death for example, um, in the 1500s, a number of people were burned at the stake because they taught their children the Lord's Prayer in English
Hmm.
rather than in Latin, and that was a crime so terrible that they were burned at the stake for it. So this was an authorized edition in that the translators were not going to be put to death for translating the Bible into English. And so, interestingly, the King James itself, people seem to think that it was a once and for all sort of thing, that was it. We don't need anything since then. But the King James itself was revised a number of times. It came out in 1611, and then in 1613, a revised edition came out that made 400 changes. And then in 1762, another revised edition came out that made 383 changes. In 1769, another edition came out that made an additional 76 changes. And then, of course, in the late 1800s, further revisions were made, but they were so significant that they no longer called it the King James Bible. It started having other names after that. So the edition that people use today, that if you go to the Christian bookstore and buy one, it's the 1769 edition that you're buying, not the 1611 edition.
If somebody buys the New King James Bible, is that correct as well?
That is a further revision, primarily changing the language to try to bring it a little more up to date. They more or less use the same textual base, though they will put notes in footnotes where the text they're basing it on differs from from the text that most other modern translations are made from. So it's primarily changing the language a little bit.
Okay, so if you bought the King James Bible in 1985, what version would that be, or what edition would that be?
It would be the 1769 edition.
1769.
Unless it says the New King James translation, which is something different again.
Okay.
But it's interesting. I've had people take my class who were fervent, almost, if I could use this word, rabid advocates of the King James Version, and one of them gave me a book that he thought was a very significant book, basically saying why the King James Version is the one and only inspired version. And if you read anything else, this book actually said, if you read anything other than the King James, you will get a demon, because all other translations are inspired by Satan. And so I read that book just to try to understand where these people were coming from, and it's disappointing to me that people would get so wound up over translations like this. But would you like me to mention why I think we need translations beyond the King James?
Yes.
Well, up until the time the King James came out, certainly when it came out, it was the best translation of the Bible into English that had ever been made up until that time. And it was revision of translations going back about 100 years approximately. There had been many translations, and each one sort of a revision of the one that went before. And the King James was no different. It was a revision of the Bishop's Bible that had come out in 1602. And so, as I'm saying, up until that time, it was the best translation. But here are some reasons why we would want newer translations. Number one, since 1611, hundreds, if not thousands, of additional manuscripts have been discovered. And so the King James people, they used the best manuscripts that were available at that time, but thousands of manuscripts, both in Greek, Hebrew, and in other versions like Latin and other languages where the Bible had been translated into other languages, have been discovered since then. So scholars nowadays can draw on all this additional information. Secondly, knowledge of Greek and Hebrew has greatly improved in the last 400 years, partly because of all these other manuscripts that have been discovered. Knowledge of how to translate words that were a little iffy back then are clearer now. So that's a significant point. Third, and this is very important, the English language has evolved and changed in the last 400 years. My wife and I enjoy going to see plays written by Shakespeare, but the language that Shakespeare used, which is similar to the language of the King James Bible, is very different than English nowadays. Many words have changed their meaning or have disappeared, and we have thousands of new words. So in order to communicate God's Word to today's generation, we need to use modern language that today's people can understand. I think that's really important. The fourth point is that the King James translators had some political and theological constraints that resulted in some poor translation choices. They were authorized by the king, but and also the Anglican Church, the Church of England, was basically all powerful at that time, and certainly they did not want to get into hot water either with the king or with the church, and so that sort of tempered or influenced some of their translation choices. So, for example, they would use the word bishop rather than overseer, or they would transliterate and use the word baptism instead of translating it as immerse, or they would use the word church instead of assembly or gathering or congregation, something like that. Just some quick choices there. So I've wondered if the people who translated the King James Bible were alive today and were asked to do a translation, what would they produce? Would they produce the King James Version? And I would say absolutely not. They would produce a modern translation using modern English because they were scholars and at that time used the best manuscript evidence they had. They would do the same thing nowadays. They would use all the manuscripts that have been discovered and use a modern Greek text. So I think people who think that God's Word is just in the King James Version are very short-sighted. And what do they do with the issue even of people who don't speak English? If you speak German or French or Spanish, how are they supposed to get God's Word if it's only in the King James Version? So it's an interesting subject, and again, I would invite people to send in questions or comments. What do you think, Steve? Do you have any additional comments?
One comment that I have, for example, 1 Timothy 3:1 always comes to my mind, that says, "He that desires the office of a bishop desires a good thing." Well, that word bishop isn't really the best translation. Is that correct?
Well, no, it isn't. And is the word office there either?
No, it's not. The word office is not found in the original text.
Yeah, and so there's an example where political and theological constraints came to bear, and not wanting to get in trouble, they had to translate in a way that would sort of support what was around them, which was the hierarchical structure of the Anglican Church.
Exactly.
And I grew up in the Anglican Church for the first 20 or so years of my life, so I'm quite familiar with that.
And that one verse has gone a long way to shape our whole ecclesiastical system since those days, which has been shaped on a very false premise, wouldn't you think?
I think so. It's unfortunate. Another example that gets quoted a lot, and this is an example of just not understanding the meaning of words, and since then we've found out some better ways to translate words, is the phrase or the verse that gets quoted a lot, "Abstain from every appearance of evil," is in the King James. Now, newer translations will have something like "abstain from every form of evil." But because it says appearance of evil, and maybe it's that the English language itself has changed a little bit, but that gets quoted all the time to say, oh, you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that because someone might think that that's evil or it has the appearance of evil. But that's not Paul. That's not what Paul was saying. He was saying avoid every form of evil,
Exactly.
not implying that you shouldn't do a million things because somebody somewhere might think that that's evil.
Exactly.
That's not what he intended at all.
Exactly. Well, we're coming to an end, this podcast, but we're going to continue on because it's a big subject, and I think we've got a few more things we can say. So we will continue next week on the King James Bible. And until then, thanks for listening, everybody. You can find About Jesus podcast on my website, stevesweetman.com, or on iTunes. And thank you, Robert, and we will talk next week about this very subject.
See you then.
Thank you.